Europe is at the center of the global pandemic, but solidarity among the governments of the European Union has been strikingly absent. Political fault lines have reopened, and it's now feared that tensions over the cost of the looming economic depression could feed nationalism and far-right populism. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Leila Faromarzi, and in this episode of The Outbreak, we'll be talking about how the pandemic's shockwaves can affect the EU.
What COVID-19 does to humans is that it gets a person's body to attack itself. In the worst cases, the body's autoimmune system essentially goes haywire as it tries to fight off the infection. This can lead to serious inflammation in the lungs and ultimately to major organ failure. This is not a medical report, just wanted to explain the effect of the coronavirus on humans since it seems to have a similar effect on the European Union system. Since the start of the pandemic, instead of working together, the bloc started to attack itself. The mechanisms designed to facilitate international cooperation, like borders and trade, began to work against this cooperation. In the worst cases, countries began to fight over the very medical supplies that, if shared equitably, could save the largest number of people. For decades, the European Union has built up institutional cooperation across the economy, politics, and culture. So people thought that this cooperation would lead to an effective response towards a threat like the coronavirus.
We're working on all fronts against coronavirus. This is an emergency situation that requires extraordinary action.
Citizens of the bloc thought the EU will react to the disaster in a unified manner. They were wrong. Perhaps it all started with Italy. The country was the first hotspot to emerge in the European Union. Soon, it became the new epicenter of the disease, and the number of deaths kept surging. The country faced massive shortages in hospital staff, medical supplies, and available testing. So they asked their allies in the bloc for help. The EU's response was largely bureaucratic and more in consultation form. When it came to concrete assistance, the EU had little to offer Italy. Italy asked to activate the EU mechanism of civil protection for the supply of medical equipment for individual protection. But not a single EU country responded to the Commission's call. Worse, a number of European countries, like France and Germany, actually imposed export limits on critical medical supplies for fear that they would need them in the coming days. That's why last week, Italy's Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, said the very future of the EU was at stake over its response to the coronavirus. Spain is agreeing with Italy in this statement. After all, if you can't turn to your friends in the time of crisis, who can you turn to?
We already saw that despairing Italian and Spanish leaders have warned that the EU itself is at risk of falling apart. But can a pandemic have such an effect? Let's ask our guest. Today we are joined by Daniele Pozzati, Italian journalist and political analyst based in Munich. He specializes in Italian and EU affairs. From Munich, hello and welcome to the show. Do tell, why did the EU hesitate in helping Italy and Spain when they were hit by COVID-19?
Because the EU, here we should say the Eurogroup, which is the informal gathering of the finance ministers of the Eurozone, the Eurogroup is dominated by Northern European countries, and it's led by Germany. And Germany has always opposed a transfer union, as they call it. Germany has always opposed mutualization of debt, has always opposed sharing the financial consequences of a crisis within the EU. And unfortunately, the coronavirus has not been an exception. Italy and Spain push for Eurobonds. And Eurobonds amount to just that. It's a kind of European public debt, so to speak. They are government bonds, EU government bonds, with which the cost, the financial consequences of the corona crisis will be divided across Europe. And And precisely that, Eurobonds as a mean of sharing financial consequences to the crisis, it's precisely what Germany is against.
Thank you. Talk to you again later in the show. The way the European Union acts today will determine everyone's post-pandemic future. So far, it is not Europe's finest hour. Solidarity is becoming a hollow mantra, and the EU brand is tarnished.
The European Union has always tried to paint a picture in which all members are unified and strong. The bloc began this year reinvigorated, having seen off the threat of Brexit with a unity of purpose that typically eludes it when faced with such existential challenges. Its new leadership team, under Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, was fired up with a vision for the EU as a global leader in climate sustainability and democratic standards. But look what a difference a few months and a global pandemic can make. The pathogen has created a chaos that dragged the EU back into the quicksand of its own dysfunction. Problems are emerging from everywhere, from a sluggish political response to the crisis to bitter internal rows about how to mitigate the economic effects of coronavirus. In short, member states have turned against one another and onto themselves.
It is of utmost importance that emergency measures are not at the expense of our fundamental principles and values as set out in the treaties.
Experts believe the EU's immediate reaction to the crisis had been slow, off the mark. The chief problem Brussels repeatedly faces is that it must operate at two speeds. On the one hand, the EU's machinery acts as a pan-European arbiter, coordinating the issues that place the Union in peril from a centralized seat of power. On the other, decisions on many substantive issues are reached through agreements collectively struck between member states. And as we have seen in recent years, they have vastly differing priorities. Each time this canyon appears, it exposes the limitations of the EU. This has been shown to be the case from the moment the coronavirus pandemic hit the continent. While EU officials are quick to point out the measures it took that allowed the bloc to work together on the procurement of medicines and equipment, when it comes to healthcare policy, the EU has little authority.
The coronavirus has given hope to those who wish to see the EU stumble. Countries have put their own needs first, and trust among governments has diminished. A long-running north-south rift over the future of the Eurozone risks widening into a deadly breach. Let's see what people said about the situation in Europe on social media. A lot of people think the European Union is a failed project. Then there are also those who say a lack of having a unified vision will lead to the collapse of the EU. However, there were a group who thought leaving the EU after the pandemic is even worse. The European Commission has struggled to give strong leadership, but most of the key levers on health, borders and the economy remain in national capitals. So what is it going to be next? What will happen after the pandemic is over?
Last week, EU member states agreed on a €500 billion package of funds from the European Stability Mechanism, the European Investment Bank, and the European Commission to help countries struggling pay for public services, keep businesses afloat, and to help people who have lost their jobs as a result of the crisis. The deal was only struck long hours of discussions, as some members insisted that the funds should come with strict terms and conditions attached. Wealthier nations were not happy with the terms of the agreement, but at the end, they gave in. Such tensions between EU member states existed long before the coronavirus. Brexit provided a brief respite, offering the opportunity to unite against a common threat. That unity, it turned out, was fleeting. Now, the most severe international crisis in decades is bringing into question the very foundations of the post-war European project. Even now, nations that have been hit hardest by the pandemic and saw no assistance from fellow EU members are questioning the nature of this alignment.
Sono giusti, cioè ci dobbiamo aiutare tutti in questo momento. Quindi è giusto che vengano come noi aiuteremo altri paesi quando ci sarà bisogno.
There were videos on social media showing Italians burning the EU flag. This means the far-right populist vision of the EU might take over after the outbreak. They see the bloc as a loose union of nations with minimal political integration. As for now, the EU members have bigger worries. The pandemic is raging on and testing every government one after another. It's testing the Europeans as a union as well. Even if the pandemic spread slows and life gradually returns to something resembling normality, the knock-on effects of the past few months will be felt for years. The EU will most likely spend those years reflecting on how it responded to the crisis and if, in its current form, it would better handle any similar crisis in the future. In simple words, after this is over, they can't all go back to sitting around the table and pretend that this did not happen.
To get more insight on the issue, let's bring in our guest one more time. Hello again, Daniel Pozzatti. Can you tell me, do you see the European Union disappearing from existence after the pandemic?
I mean, that's a matter for speculation, and at the moment, what I can see more plausible, it's more likely to happen, is that if Italy and Spain, starved of cash, are forced to ask for a loan by the European Stability Mechanism. This is what the EU and Germany want Italy and Spain to do. They want Italy and Spain to apply for a loan, to request financial assistance from the European Stability Mechanism. Now, the problem is that such loans come under the supervision of the Troika, the Troika can then impose structural reforms, as it did with Greece in 2015. Now, a Greek scenario in Italy and Spain, that might lead to, like, even Italy or Spain leaving the EU or leaving the euro. That's a possibility. But I would not, it's not something that's going to affect the whole of the EU. You may have, as I said, Italy and Spain leaving the euro, being forced to leave the euro, having to leave the euro eventually.
Thanks for the contribution, Daniel Pozzatti from Munich. That's it for today. Don't forget to watch our next program. I've been Leila Faromarzi, and on behalf of the whole team here, thanks for watching. Look after yourselves and each other.